A door closed in her face. The golden morning sun cast long shadows across the towering glass exterior of Hamilton and Gold Trust, a prestigious financial institution in the heart of the city. The bank's name gleamed in bold, gold-plated letters, symbolizing power, wealth, and exclusivity. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished mahogany, fresh espresso, and cold ambition. It was the kind of place where deals were made behind closed doors, where wealth determined status, and where certain unspoken rules governed who was welcome and who was merely tolerated. Victoria Allen stepped through the massive double doors with an air of quiet confidence. Dressed in an elegant tailored black blazer, crisp white blouse, and a knee-length pencil skirt, she exuded the aura of a woman who knew her worth. Her natural curls were styled in an immaculate updo, and a pair of simple yet exquisite pearl earrings adorned her ears. She held a sleek leather portfolio tucked under her arm. Inside, a proposal that had taken her years to refine, filled with figures, projections, and the future she had meticulously built for herself. Today was supposed to be a formality. She had been pre-approved for a business loan of $5 million, the final step in expanding Allen & Co., the real estate empire she had built from the ground up. What had once started as a small, single-property rental company was now one of the fastest-growing real estate firms in the city, catering to high-end clients, corporate offices, and commercial properties. This wasn't just another transaction for her. This was a milestone. The bank's polished floor reflected her poised stance as she approached the reception desk. The woman sitting there was Heather, a young blonde receptionist in her mid-20s, typing away at her screen, her nails painted a perfect shade of nude pink. Victoria offered her a professional yet warm smile. "Good morning. I have a 10:30 appointment with Mr. Caldwell," Victoria said, her voice smooth and composed. Heather's fingers paused briefly over the keyboard before her gaze flickered up, registering Victoria's deep brown skin, sharp features, and unwavering confidence. There was a hesitation, small, nearly imperceptible, but Victoria noticed it. "Name?" Heather asked, barely masking the indifference in her tone. "Victoria Allen," she responded without missing a beat. Heather typed for a moment, then pursed her lips. A pause, a frown, a flick of the eyes. "Take a seat. He'll be with you shortly," Heather finally said, already turning back to her screen, her interest in the conversation evaporating. Victoria gave a small nod and walked to the waiting area, seating herself gracefully. She was 15 minutes early. She could wait. At first, the silence was unremarkable. The bank was a constant rhythm of footsteps, murmured conversations, and the occasional ringing phone. But as the minutes ticked by, something became increasingly clear. Victoria watched as customers who arrived long after her were swiftly greeted and escorted to their appointments. A middle-aged white man in khakis and a sweater vest strolled in, barely 5 minutes inside before a banker shook his hand and led him to a private office. Then came a woman in an expensive red suit, clutching a designer bag. She wasn't even asked to sit. A banker came straight to her. Victoria glanced at the time. 10:50 a.m. She shifted slightly in her seat, crossing her legs. "All right, no problem," she thought to herself. Caldwell might just be running late. Then another client arrived. No appointment, no scheduled meeting. Just a simple, "I need to talk to someone real quick." Within 5 minutes, he was led inside. Victoria exhaled slowly, pressing her lips together. She wasn't being ignored. She was being dismissed. Her grip on the portfolio tightened as the realization settled in. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't coincidence. It was deliberate. Her mind flickered back to the years of experiences like these. The subtle dismissals, the polite rejections wrapped in empty smiles, the way people underestimated her the moment they saw her, before they even knew her credentials, before they realized just who she was. She stood up. With the same poised confidence she had walked in with, she approached the reception desk once more. Heather barely looked up. "Excuse me," Victoria said smoothly, keeping her tone controlled. "I had a 10:30 with Mr. Caldwell. It's now 11:15. Is he still in a meeting?" Heather sighed, finally glancing up, but only for a second. "Yes, he's still tied up. You'll have to wait until he's available." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Right, but I've seen several people get taken in without appointments, so I'd like a more specific answer. How much longer?" Heather rolled her eyes slightly, typing something onto her screen, pretending to check something, before letting out another sigh. "I don't control his schedule, Mom," Heather said, her voice slightly condescending. "Ma'am," Victoria thought, her patience wearing thin. Not Ms. Allen, not Victoria, just a dismissive ma'am like she was another unimportant walk-in. She took a slow, measured breath. "All right," Victoria said, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. "I'll wait a little longer." But this time, she didn't sit down. She stayed standing, near the entrance, watching. 11:30 a.m. Another customer arrived, casually dressed. White. No appointment. 5 minutes later, a banker came and greeted him with a smile, leading him to an office. Victoria's heartbeat was steady, but her blood ran hot. She had two choices now. She could walk away, take her business somewhere else, forget this entire thing. Or she could wait. Something inside her told her that this wasn't over yet. What she didn't know was just how much things were about to change, not just for her, but for everyone in that bank. Because within the next hour, the person they dismissed as an afterthought would become the biggest mistake they ever made. And it would be too late for them to fix it. The breaking point. The wall clock inside Hamilton and Gold Trust ticked mercilessly. The rhythmic sound of seconds passing became a drumbeat in Victoria Allen's ears as she stood near the entrance, her arms crossed, her leather portfolio still tucked under her arm. 11:45 a.m. It had been an hour and 15 minutes past her scheduled appointment. She wasn't a walk-in customer. She wasn't here to ask for spare change or a credit card inquiry. She was here to finalize a multi-million-dollar business loan, a deal that would not only benefit her company but would also bring immense profit to the very institution that was currently treating her like she was invisible. Victoria's patience had reached its limit. She had been underestimated before, dismissed before, ignored before, but never by someone who was about to regret it this badly. Taking a steady breath, she walked back up to the reception desk, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The sound alone made Heather, the receptionist, glance up briefly before pretending to focus back on her screen. Victoria didn't wait for permission to speak. "Heather," she said, her voice controlled. "I need to speak with Mr. Caldwell now." Heather let out an exaggerated sigh, as if she were being asked to run across the city barefoot instead of doing the job she was being paid to do. "Ma'am, as I told you, he's in a meeting. You'll have to wait." Victoria tilted her head slightly, her sharp brown eyes narrowing. "Heather, I've watched no fewer than 7 people walk into private offices within the last hour, some of them without appointments." She paused for effect. "Yet, I, someone with a confirmed, pre-scheduled meeting, have been made to wait for nearly 2 hours. Heather rolled her eyes this time. That was it. That single dismissive gesture was the final straw. Victoria's heartbeat slowed, not in anger, but in calculated determination. They had played the wrong game with the wrong woman. "Heather," she said again, but this time, there was no warmth in her voice. "Get up from this desk. Walk down that hall. Tell Mr. Caldwell that Victoria Allen is here, and that if he does not come out in the next 5 minutes, I will be making the direct call to the board of directors." The word struck like an iron hammer against cold steel. Heather's fingers froze over the keyboard. Her eyes darted up to finally look at Victoria properly for the first time that day. Excuse me," she stammered, the previous arrogance in her voice now slipping. Victoria's smile was polite, but it carried the sharp edge of a blade. "You heard me. Heather's face turned slightly pale as she hesitated, but before she could react, a new voice entered the conversation. "Is there a problem here?" A tall, lean man with slicked-back gray hair, piercing blue eyes, and a designer suit stepped forward. "Mr. Caldwell, the senior branch manager of Hamilton and Gold Trust." Victoria turned to him calmly, smoothly, like she had all the time in the world. "Mr. Caldwell," she greeted, her voice steady. "How generous of you to finally acknowledge me." There was no mistaking the meaning behind her words. Caldwell's eyes flickered for the briefest moment, realizing immediately that something was very, very wrong. He forced a smile. "Ah, Miss Allen, I—" Victoria held up a hand, silencing him. "Let's skip the empty apologies. I was scheduled for a 10:30 a.m. appointment. It is now nearly noon. In that time, I have watched multiple individuals, all of whom arrived long after me, be taken care of immediately. Now you tell me, why is that?" Heather visibly gulped. Caldwell, to his credit, didn't flinch, but Victoria saw the tension in his shoulders. He was already crafting a lie in his head. "Miss Allen, I assure you there was no discrimination," Victoria finished for him. Silence. A few heads turned from across the bank's floor. A couple of employees had paused what they were doing, sensing the tension in the air. Victoria stepped forward, not aggressively, but with the calm presence of a woman who held power in her hands, even if they didn't realize it yet. "You and I both know exactly what happened here today, Mr. Caldwell," she continued. "And I also know what happens when people like you make the mistake of assuming who I am." Caldwell's smile twitched, his fingers tightening slightly around the gold pen in his hand. "Miss Allen, I can assure you, this is simply an unfortunate scheduling error." "An error," Victoria repeated, voice low. "An error that resulted in a multi-million-dollar client being ignored for almost 2 hours, while others were seen within minutes." Caldwell opened his mouth to argue, but a new voice interrupted. "What's going on here?" The room went completely silent. 4 individuals, 3 men and 1 woman, all dressed in impeccably tailored business suits, had entered the main floor. The Hamilton and Gold Trust Board of Directors. And they were looking directly at Victoria. Caldwell visibly stiffened. Victoria, however, simply smiled. "Mr. Harrington," she greeted, addressing the elderly man with silver hair and a firm gaze, who was easily the most powerful figure in the bank. The man smiled back, genuine and warm. "Victoria, I had no idea you were meeting here today," he said, stepping forward to shake her hand. Caldwell's face turned an unhealthy shade of gray. "It was supposed to be a simple loan finalization," Victoria said smoothly. "But instead, I seem to have encountered some unexpected delays." Harrington's smile disappeared immediately. "Delays?" he repeated, his sharp gaze snapping toward Caldwell. Caldwell looked like a man standing on a cliff's edge, ready to fall. "Explain," Harrington said, his voice dangerously calm. Victoria tilted her head slightly, watching Caldwell carefully. This was the moment. This was the very moment his entire world began to crumble, and she didn't even have to say another word. The reckoning begins. For the first time that morning, the power dynamic in Hamilton and Gold Trust had shifted. Victoria Allen was no longer the one waiting. She stood in absolute silence, her presence commanding, as the board of directors, 4 of the most powerful individuals in the entire institution, stared down the man who had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Mr. Caldwell was visibly rattled. His normally smooth demeanor, the same smug confidence he had carried when ignoring Victoria, was now gone. Mr. Harrington, the senior board member with silver hair and a gaze like sharpened steel, stood inches away from him. The weight of his authority pressed against Caldwell's shoulders like an anvil. "Delays," Harrington repeated, his voice measured but dangerously firm. He wasn't asking. He was demanding an answer. Caldwell swallowed. He tried to fix his tie. a nervous tick. But his fingers fumbled slightly, a sign of a man scrambling for control. "Sir, I was handling other high-priority clients this morning, and Miss Allen's case was." He stopped himself. The second he looked at Victoria, his mistake hit him like a freight train. Her eyes never left him. She wasn't angry. She wasn't flustered. She was watching him drown. And she was letting him. Harrington's frown deepened. "Miss Allen's case," he echoed, crossing his arms. "Would you care to explain what exactly made her case any less of a priority than the others you've seen this morning?" Caldwell hesitated. He was about to lie. Victoria could see it in his eyes. There were certain procedural steps that required additional review before I called." "That's a lie." Victoria cut in smoothly, without hesitation. A tense silence fell across the bank floor. Caldwell's mouth snapped shut, like a door slamming close. Victoria stepped forward, not aggressively, but with absolute purpose. "You and I both know there were no additional reviews," she said, her voice even, but sharp as a blade. "I was pre-approved. My financials were already vetted. This was a simple finalization meeting." She tilted her head slightly. And yet, I was made to wait for nearly 2 hours, while multiple individuals, all of whom arrived after me, some without appointments, were seen immediately. Harrington's expression darkened. "Is this true, Caldwell?" he asked, his voice low. Caldwell's entire body language shifted, from defensive to outright panic. His eyes darted toward Heather, as if silently begging her for backup. Heather, who had spent the entire morning dismissing Victoria, was now frozen in place, her face pale, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk like a child caught red-handed. For the first time, she wasn't rolling her eyes. She wasn't brushing Victoria off. She was terrified. Victoria allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "Go on, Caldwell," she urged, tilting her head. "Tell them the real reason why I was made to wait." Caldwell looked away. He couldn't say it, because if he did, it would be the final nail in his coffin. Harrington let out a slow, measured exhale. He already knew. He had seen this before, too many times. "Linda," he said suddenly, turning toward the only woman on the board, a shrewd, no-nonsense executive with sharp cheekbones and an even sharper reputation. "Review Miss Allen's file," Harrington instructed. "I want every detail of her loan request cross-checked with the approvals that were made this morning." Caldwell's face drained of color. "Sir, there's no need for that." "On the contrary," Linda interrupted coolly. "There's every need for that." She didn't even wait for Caldwell's response. She pulled out a sleek tablet, tapped a few buttons, and within seconds, Victoria's full financial history, credit score, business assets, and profitability reports were displayed. Linda's eyes scanned the numbers. Then, her eyebrows lifted. "These numbers are impeccable," she murmured, tilting the tablet toward Harrington. "This is one of the strongest applications I've ever seen. Not only should she have been approved immediately, but she qualifies for a higher amount than she even requested." Harrington took one look at the screen. Then, he turned back to Caldwell. "Explain yourself," he said coldly. Caldwell's lips parted slightly, his mouth dry. He had nothing. Because the truth was in plain sight. He had dismissed Victoria not because of her qualifications, but because of his own bias. He had assumed she was beneath him. He had assumed she had no power. And now, his mistake was on full display for the most powerful people in the room. Harrington's patience was gone. "Caldwell," he said, his voice a low warning. "I want to be very clear. This bank does not operate under the kind of bias that you've just demonstrated today. What you've done is not only a breach of professional conduct, but it's also a violation of every value we claim to stand for." He paused, then added, "Your position here is no longer tenable." The finality in his voice was unmistakable. Caldwell staggered back slightly, eyes wide, mouth trembling. "Sir, please." "Save it. Linda cut in sharply, her cold, dark eyes flashing with disgust. "Consider yourself dismissed." Caldwell's world imploded. Heather let out a small, strangled gasp, realizing just how badly she had miscalculated the situation. But Victoria, she remained calm, unshaken. Caldwell had underestimated her. Now he was the one being dismissed like he was nothing. The poetic justice was undeniable. As two security personnel entered, discreetly but firmly, to escort Caldwell out, Victoria stepped forward one last time. She adjusted the cuff of her blazer, met his panicked gaze, and said in a voice of quiet steel, "Next time, Caldwell, don't assume you know who you're dealing with." Then she turned, never looking back. As she walked toward the exit, Harrington followed. "Victoria," he called. She turned, eyebrows raised. His expression was nothing but respect. "Name your terms," he said simply. "I want this bank to be the one funding your expansion." Victoria smiled. She already knew the answer. But now it was on her terms. The aftermath of power. The heavy glass doors of Hamilton and Gold Trust swung open as Victoria Allen stepped outside, her sharp heels clicking against the polished stone walkway. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow across the city, but she hardly noticed. Behind her, through the tall windows, she could see the disgraced figure of Caldwell being escorted toward his office by security. His once confident posture was gone, his steps unsteady. Heather, the receptionist who had dismissed Victoria so effortlessly, stood frozen at her desk, her face pale as she typed nervously on her computer, likely sending out frantic emails to salvage what little she could of her own position. The fall of Caldwell had sent shockwaves through the bank. But Victoria wasn't finished yet. The board's proposition. "Miss Allen," a voice called from behind her. She turned, finding Harrington, the senior board member, standing just outside the entrance. Behind him, Linda Porter and the other executives had followed, their expressions a mixture of apology, respect, and anticipation. "Walk with me," Harrington said, motioning toward the street where his black company car was parked. Victoria tilted her head slightly. She had won. She didn't owe them anything. But she was also a businesswoman first. So, with a small nod, she fell into step beside him. The city bustled around them, taxis honking, pedestrians weaving through traffic, but their conversation was its own world. "First, let me say, what happened back there was inexcusable," Harrington began. "Caldwell was arrogant, reckless, and, quite frankly, a liability. But I suspect you already knew that." Victoria gave a small, knowing smile. "Oh, I knew. I just let him dig his own grave." Linda, walking a few steps behind them, let out a quiet chuckle. "I like her," she muttered under her breath. Harrington smirked but then grew serious. "That being said, Victoria, I don't want your last memory of this bank to be that disaster." She raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "We want to work with you," he said plainly. "Caldwell's incompetence doesn't represent how we do business. And frankly, after reviewing your financials, I'm shocked we didn't approach you first. You're exactly the kind of high-caliber client we should be prioritizing." Linda nodded. "Your expansion project. We're prepared to offer you not just the loan you originally applied for, but a fully tailored financial package that extends beyond just capital funding. Business consultation, investment opportunities, full asset management, everything you need to take Allen & Co. to the next level." Victoria slowed her steps. She turned toward them both, her expression unreadable. "Let me get this straight," she said smoothly. "After 2 hours of treating me like an afterthought, now you're offering me more than what I originally came for." Linda exhaled sharply, nodding. "Because we realized our mistake." Harrington's face remained serious. "Because we know your value now," he corrected. Victoria studied them both carefully. For a long moment, she let the silence sit between them. Then, finally, she smiled. "I'll consider your offer," she said simply. "But on my terms." Harrington nodded, completely unoffended. That's all we ask. A new era for Allen and Co. The meeting at Hamilton and Gold Trust had ended in a way that none of them had predicted, with Victoria holding all the power. As she climbed into the back seat of her own private car, she pulled out her phone and dialed a familiar number. Within 2 rings, a deep, authoritative voice answered. Allen. Victoria's lips curled into a small smirk. Darren, we're moving forward. Her chief financial officer immediately understood. With Hamilton and Gold? He asked. Victoria let out a soft chuckle. Oh no, she mused. I'll let them sweat a little first. Because power was not just about winning. It was about making sure they never forgot who they had underestimated in the first place. She wasn't just walking away with a loan. She was walking away with the knowledge that from now on, they would treat her name with the respect it deserved. And if they didn't, she had plenty of other banks that would fight for her business. Back at the bank, the fallout. Inside Hamilton and Gold Trust, the fallout from Caldwell's downfall had already begun. Heather sat rigid at her desk, her fingers trembling slightly as she sent out frantic emails, her once dismissive attitude now replaced with pure fear. Across the floor, security escorted Caldwell out of the building. Every employee watched in stunned silence. They had seen him belittle people before. They had seen him play favorites before. But they had never seen him face the consequences. Until today. Linda and Harrington stood near the executive offices, their gazes locked on the scene below. That was a hell of a wake-up call, Linda muttered. Harrington nodded. And one we deserved. They knew that Victoria Allen wouldn't just walk away from this quietly. And they knew that, from now on, they would have to earn her trust back, one step at a time. But whether she would even let them, that was up to her. The power shift. Victoria leaned back in her seat, her car gliding through the streets of the city. The towering skyscrapers and flashing billboards reflected against the tinted windows, but her mind was laser-focused. This wasn't just a victory. This was a message, one that Hamilton and Gold Trust would never forget. Her phone buzzed. A message from her assistant, Monica. Monica. Just received calls from 2 competing banks. Both heard about the Caldwell situation. They want to meet ASAP. What should I tell them? Victoria smirked. Word had already spread. Banking was an industry of whispers, reputations, and connections. And the moment one institution fumbled with a high-profile client, the sharks began circling. She tapped a reply. Victoria. Tell them I'm interested. Set up meetings for next week. I want to hear their offers. She wasn't just moving forward with business as usual. She was about to make them all compete for her. Back at Hamilton and Gold Trust, the board takes action. Inside the executive conference room of Hamilton and Gold, the air was tense. The board of directors had gathered immediately after Victoria left, the echo of her power move still hanging in the air. Caldwell was gone. The mess he left behind, however, was still smoldering. Linda Porter leaned forward, scrolling through her tablet, reviewing Victoria's profile, financials, and business empire. Unbelievable, she muttered, shaking her head. We nearly burned a bridge with one of the most successful real estate moguls in this city. And for what? Her cold eyes flickered toward Heather, who sat uncomfortably in the corner, still clutching her tablet, as if it could shield her from the consequences. I was just following Caldwell's orders, Heather stammered. He told me to prioritize certain clients over others. Linda slammed her tablet onto the table, making Heather jump. I don't care what Caldwell told you, Linda snapped. You work for this bank, not for whatever prejudices he carried. And right now, because of that stupidity, we're on the verge of losing a client who could have brought in millions. Heather's face burned with shame. Harrington, sitting at the head of the table, let out a slow, deliberate sigh. We have to fix this. Immediately, he said. He turned to Mason Blackwell, the head of corporate relations. Get in touch with Victoria Allen. Set up another meeting. I want her to know we're ready to do whatever it takes to regain her trust." Mason adjusted his tie, hesitating slightly. "That might not be so easy, sir." Harrington's gaze hardened. "Why not?" Mason pulled out his phone, scrolling for a moment before turning the screen toward the board. It was an online article from a financial news site, updated just minutes ago. The headline read, "Hamilton and Gold faces PR nightmare after alleged discrimination against prominent real estate CEO." Sources say competitor banks are already making offers to secure Allen & Co.'s business. Will Victoria Allen leave Hamilton and Gold? The financial world watches closely. The room fell silent. Linda let out a low whistle, shaking her head. "She's playing chess, and we've been playing checkers," she muttered. Harrington exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a brief moment. "Damn it," he muttered. "She's got us exactly where she wants us." And she did. Victoria Allen wasn't just a businesswoman. She was a strategist. And now, they were the ones being played. Victoria's next move. Power on her terms. Victoria's car pulled up to the sleek glass entrance of Allen & Co. headquarters, a modern high-rise overlooking the financial district. Inside, she stepped into her private office, a spacious, minimalist design with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning city view. Her chief financial officer, Darren Walker, was already waiting. He stood as she entered, offering her a knowing smirk. "That was one hell of a move, boss," he said, crossing his arms. "So, what's next?" Victoria didn't hesitate. "I'm going to make them sweat," she said, placing her portfolio on her desk. "Hamilton and Gold will try to salvage this, but now, they're not my only option." She turned toward the window, watching the traffic move below. "Two other banks have reached out. They're hungry for a deal, and they know what happened today. I want meetings set up. By next week, I want to see exactly what they're willing to offer me." Darren nodded. "And Hamilton and Gold." Victoria's lips curled into a smirk. "Oh, they'll come back. And when they do, I want them to know they're no longer my first choice. They're my backup plan." Darren chuckled, shaking his head. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." Victoria laughed, her eyes glinting. "Darren, you're on my side, which means we're about to win. Big." And as she sat down in her leather chair, crossing her legs with quiet confidence, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't just taking her business to the next level. She was about to make history, and every bank in the city was about to fight for her. The ultimate power move. Victoria Allen sat behind the sleek oak desk of her office, her fingertips lightly drumming against the polished surface. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the bustling skyline of the city, but her focus wasn't on the view. It was on the stack of proposals laid out in front of her. 3 competing banks, all vying for her business. Each proposal was better than the last, each offer more enticing than anything Hamilton and Gold Trust had ever considered giving her. Her phone buzzed. "Monica, Hamilton and Gold just called again. Harrington is requesting a meeting. He says it's urgent." Victoria's smirk was slow and deliberate. Of course, it was urgent. After the public relations disaster caused by Caldwell's discrimination, they were bleeding. Investors were asking questions, clients were paying attention, and now they were scrambling to undo the damage. But she wasn't in a hurry to save them. "Victoria, tell him I'm busy. I'll see them on my time." She set the phone down, leaning back in her chair. They had underestimated her once. They would never make that mistake again. The competition gets desperate. The next morning, Victoria walked into a private conference room at the Grand Summit Hotel, where she had scheduled meetings with the competing banks. Her CFO, Darren Walker, was already inside, flipping through the latest financials. "You ready?" he asked, grinning. Victoria smiled. They are. The first bank, Paramount Financial, had sent their senior VP and a private investment manager. They wasted no time getting to the point. "Miss Allen, We've reviewed your financials, and quite frankly, we were blown away. We want to be your primary financial partner, not just for this expansion, but for all future projects. We're prepared to offer a $10 million credit line, significantly reducing interest rates, and full flexibility on your terms. Victoria arched an eyebrow. That's quite the offer, she said smoothly, but she wasn't impressed just yet. Next came Riverton Bank, a powerhouse in commercial lending. Their team of 4 executives sat across from her, their proposal meticulously laid out. Miss Allen, we've been following your success for years. Not only do we want to fund this project, but we'd like to offer you a seat on our advisory board. That made Darren whistle softly under his breath. A board seat. That was a different level of power. But Victoria didn't react. Not yet. Finally, Eastgate Financial, the most aggressive of the 3, offered her something no one else had. Miss Allen, their CEO said, leaning forward, we believe in the future of Allen & Co. so much that we are willing to structure a deal where you receive not just a loan, but an investment stake. An investment stake. Meaning she wouldn't just be borrowing money. They would be financially invested in her company's success. Darren blinked, glancing at Victoria. They had just taken the game to a whole new level. Victoria folded her hands together, letting the silence stretch for a moment before she finally spoke. Gentlemen, I appreciate these offers, she said smoothly, but I have one final meeting before I make a decision. They knew exactly who she meant. And they knew it wasn't going to be easy for Hamilton and Gold. Hamilton and Gold's last chance. By the time Victoria finally agreed to meet with Harrington, 3 days had passed. It was long enough for them to feel the pressure. As she walked into Hamilton and Gold's executive conference room, she saw that Harrington, Linda Porter, and 2 other board members were already waiting. Heather was nowhere in sight. Neither was Caldwell. Miss Allen, Harrington greeted her, his voice carefully controlled. I appreciate you taking the time. Victoria took her seat, crossing her legs gracefully. I assume you understand why I'm here, she said. Linda nodded, tapping a folder on the table. We do, and we won't waste your time. We've reviewed everything, and we're prepared to offer you whatever it takes to make this right. Harrington pushed a document toward her. Victoria glanced down. The numbers were impressive. A $12 million loan package, prime rates, flexible repayment terms, and exclusive financial advisory services. More than she had originally asked for. But it wasn't about the money anymore. I appreciate the offer, she said, her tone unreadable. But tell me, Mr. Harrington, why should I stay? Harrington exhaled deeply. Because we're learning, he admitted. Because we know we made a mistake, and we want to rebuild this relationship on the foundation it should have had from the start. One of mutual respect and partnership. Linda leaned forward. We also know you've been meeting with other banks, she said bluntly, and we wouldn't blame you if you walked away. But we don't want that. We want to prove that we can be the institution that fully supports Allen & Co. in every way possible. Victoria leaned back, studying them carefully. She had all the power now, and she intended to use it. There's one condition, she said. Harrington nodded quickly. Name it. She met his eyes. I want a seat on the Hamilton and Gold Advisory Board. The room went silent. Linda's eyebrows lifted slightly. Harrington sat back in his chair, clearly considering the implications. Victoria's offer wasn't just about securing better financial terms. It was about making sure that what happened to her never happened again. And if they wanted her business, they had to give her a seat at the table. Harrington glanced at Linda. She nodded subtly. Finally, he exhaled and looked back at Victoria. Done. Victoria smiled slowly. She had walked into this bank being treated like she was beneath them. Now she was leaving as someone who would shape its future, and they all knew it. The final move. That evening, Victoria sat in her office, looking out over the glittering city skyline. Her phone buzzed. Monica, the contract is finalized. You officially have a seat on Hamilton and Gold's advisory board. Also, Paramount and Riverton just followed up again. They're still hoping you'll reconsider." Victoria smirked, tapping a reply. "Victoria, tell them they'll have to try harder next time." She set the phone down and took a slow breath. She had won. Not just the deal. Not just the money. She had changed the game. And now, every financial institution in the city knew one thing for certain. Victoria Allen wasn't just a client. She was a force to be reckoned with. And the next time someone tried to underestimate her, they wouldn't get a second chance. The legacy she built, the city skyline stretched endlessly beyond the vast glass windows of Allen & Co. headquarters. As the sun began to set, its golden glow bathed the towering high-rises in hues of orange and pink. Victoria Allen stood in her office, her arms crossed, watching the streets below. She had won the war. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The financial world had been forced to acknowledge her power, and Hamilton and Gold Trust had been humbled in the most public way possible. But this victory wasn't just about them. It was about what came next, and Victoria was ready to shape the future on her terms. A new beginning at Hamilton and Gold. 1 week later, Victoria stepped into the exclusive executive lounge of Hamilton and Gold's corporate offices. The place had a new energy, a different atmosphere than before. Where once the air had been thick with elitism and unspoken biases, now it carried a sense of awareness. A shift, a realization. They had learned their lesson, and Victoria was here to make sure they never forgot it. As she entered the glass-walled conference room, she was met with nods of respect from the board members. This time, no one dismissed her, no one ignored her. Harrington stood to greet her personally, extending his hand. "Victoria," he said, his tone carefully measured. "Welcome. We're honored to have you here today." She shook his hand, but her grip was firm, her eyes unwavering. "Let's make sure that honor lasts," she replied smoothly. Linda Porter smirked slightly from her seat at the table. She had grown to respect Victoria, and she knew what this moment meant. Victoria took her seat, her presence now equal to those who once overlooked her. Her first meeting as a board advisor had begun, and they all knew she wasn't here just to fill a seat. She was here to change the game, setting the new rules. "Before we begin," Victoria said, leaning forward slightly, "let's be very clear about one thing." All eyes turned toward her. What happened with Caldwell wasn't an accident. It wasn't just one man's bad judgment. It was a systemic failure, and it nearly cost this institution not just my business, but its reputation. A few executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Harrington nodded solemnly. "We agree," he said. "Good," Victoria continued, "because now we fix it." She pulled a folder from her portfolio and slid it across the table. Linda picked it up first, flipping through the pages. Her expression changed from curiosity to surprise to deep thought. "Diversity and Ethics Initiative," she read aloud. Victoria nodded. "This isn't just about my experience. This is about every entrepreneur, business owner, and investor who has ever been dismissed the way I was. This initiative will implement mandatory bias training, restructuring of lending priorities, and oversight committees to ensure that every client, regardless of background, is given fair, transparent consideration." A few board members glanced at each other. They knew what she was asking for. It wasn't just an apology. It was real, institutional change. Linda looked up. "And if we don't agree?" she asked, though the challenge in her voice was light. Victoria smiled. "Then I take my business elsewhere. And let's be honest, if I leave now, the PR disaster will only get worse." Silence. Then, Harrington leaned forward, his expression resolute. "You have my full support," he said. Linda nodded. "Mine too," she added. "It's about damn time we did something like this." One by one, every board member in the room agreed. Victoria had not only secured her place at the table, she had reshaped the table itself. This wasn't just a policy change. This was legacy work. Heather's last day. Meanwhile, on the lower floors of Hamilton and Gold, another very different meeting was taking place. Heather sat stiffly in a small office, hands folded in her lap. Across from her sat a senior HR representative, their face unreadable. After reviewing the situation, the board has decided to terminate your employment effective immediately, the representative said flatly. Heather's throat tightened. But I was just following Caldwell's lead, she stammered. The HR rep's gaze remained unmoved. And yet you chose to treat a respected client with clear disrespect, even when given multiple chances to correct it. Heather opened her mouth, then closed it. She had seen this coming. Her final mistake. Underestimating the wrong woman. As she left the building for the last time, she passed a digital billboard outside the bank. It was a press release from Hamilton and Gold, announcing their new diversity and ethics initiative. And in the featured photo, Victoria Allen, standing alongside the board. Heather swallowed hard. She had been replaced. Not just by someone better, by someone stronger. The ripple effect. The months following Victoria's victory transformed the financial industry. Hamilton and Gold Trust became a model for change, implementing the reforms she pushed for. Other banks scrambled to follow suit, realizing they could no longer afford to operate under outdated biases. Entrepreneurs from diverse backgrounds finally received the fair treatment they deserved. Victoria became more than just a successful CEO. She became a symbol of power, resilience, and change. And she wasn't done yet. 1 year later, a global expansion. Victoria stood at the front of a massive conference hall, addressing an audience of investors, entrepreneurs, and executives. Behind her, a massive banner read, Allen & Co. expands to international markets. She smiled at the hundreds of cameras flashing. A year ago, I walked into a bank expecting a simple meeting, she said. Instead, I walked out with something far greater, a mission. She glanced at the front row, where Harrington and Linda sat among other top financial leaders. Today, we don't just celebrate my company's expansion, she continued. We celebrate a shift in the financial world, one where talent, ambition, and hard work matter more than privilege or outdated systems. The audience rose in applause, standing, clapping, cheering. Victoria took a slow breath, letting the sound wash over her. She had started from nothing. She had been dismissed, ignored, undervalued, but not anymore. Now, when she walked into a room, people stood for her. And that was a power she had built herself.